Hey, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So, as you can tell from the title, I'm going to be talking about books that I really regret reading in today's video. These are books that either really disappointed me at the time, books that I feel like were a waste of time, books that put me off reading, books that caused reading slumps, books that I had a better experience as film adaptations, just all of it, because I feel like I don't make enough effort these days to talk about books that I don't particularly enjoy. I feel like I've gotten a bit too positive over the years, which really isn't my OG brand, if we're going to be perfectly honest. I used to be really nitpicky. I'd always call out things that I didn't like or enjoy, and I feel like I've gotten kind of soft in my older age. So without further ado, let's get into some of these books. So first up on the chopping board is Tampa by Alyssa. This book ruined the start of my 2022. This was the first book that I picked up that year. It took me the entirety of January to read it based on how difficult I found reading the subject matter of the book. And if you're not familiar with this book whatsoever, it's basically about a female PDF file who's also a teacher in an elementary school, and she's basically hand-picking her victims from her own class. Our main character just basically is faking her way through her adult life. She's married, but she's not happily married. She finds her husband to be disgusting and a burden. And then we have her day-to-day life as a teacher and just the facade that she's constantly trying to keep up in order to perpetrate her crimes. You're witnessing the death of a childhood, and you're witnessing the start of something that is going to cause these children lifelong problems in their own personal life, in having and maintaining relationships, in their sexual identity. It really is just a really horrific deep dive into the kind of psychopathic tendencies that certain people like that can have, and how selfish and self-centered it all really is. And the lengths that our main character Celeste goes through in order to perpetrate her crimes is just unbelievable. At one point she ends up having an affair with her first victim's father, and it's just an excuse for her to normalize her being in the household. And it's just so insidious. I think what's so interesting about this as well is that it really does break that idea of the stereotype of what a child abuser would be, and it really does emphasize on the fact that it could be anyone. It could be somebody working in your child's school, it could be somebody working in a children's hospital, it could be someone who's looking after them before you get home from work, and in that regard it is terrifying. I think the other aspect that I really struggled with it is just how unbelievably graphic it is. There was moments where I just had to put it down for a week at a time based on the fact that it was just so overly graphic. I know the author got a lot of slack at the time when the book came out, and people were very taken aback by it, that a woman could write something like this. But I always find that female authors, especially when it comes to literary fiction, go so much harder than men. And I don't know if it's just because women feel that they need to prove something, or that they really need to take things up a notch in order to be taken more seriously as a hardcore sort of writer. I feel like most of the books that I've read that have really gotten under my skin, for the most part, are written by women. And maybe it's just because they can push my buttons a little bit easier, or because it's closer to home. Tampa was just, I could never read it again. Honestly, the reading experience of Tampa was as if I was ripping off a band-aid for the entirety of January, and it really did make me struggle to pick up something else afterwards because I just felt so burnt out emotionally from it. So yeah, definitely read at your own risk if it's something that you're going to pick up. The next book that I regret reading based on just my feelings towards it afterwards is Sybil by Flora Rheta Schreiber. So originally at the time, I didn't rate this super low. I thought it was an okay book just based on reading it as a work of fiction. Because that's the thing about Sybil, if you're not familiar, is that when it originally came out, it was proclaiming to be a true story of a psychiatrist's patient who had been coming to her, and she had multiple personalities emerging from her throughout these various different psychiatric sessions. The psychiatrist then went about writing a book about it. There's a lot of, malpractice within that concept itself, but later it turned out that the woman that the character that Sybil is based on has said that it wasn't true, that she had made it up or she had exaggerated her symptoms. And then later on she came out again saying like, no, it actually is true. It is nowadays regarded as a work of fiction. But it was the first real depiction of split personality disorder. And I think that's why some people are so interested in it. I went into this not knowing that regarding split personality disorder, it usually emerges after some sort of horrible trauma that has happened, usually within childhood. It is a very interesting thing. I love reading books about mental health, especially more extreme elements that can happen to somebody's mental health. And I think that was kind of my main motivation to go into reading Sybil, aside from the fact that I was just interested in the history of it and the controversy around it. However, I was not expecting the amount of trauma that Sybil went through to be a thing. For some reason, it just didn't gel with me beforehand that if I'm going to be reading about someone who potentially has split personality disorder, there usually is a whole heap of trauma behind the reasoning as to why that has happened. And the revelation of what Sybil's mother did to her and how graphic and how violent her alleged childhood was, I just was not prepared for that. And I can say that you can put Sybil up against any extreme horror novel written today, and I would still say that that certain scene is far worse than anything that I've read in any sort of modern horror tale. It was just so over the top and so graphic and so, unbelievable that a mother could do this to their own child. So just be warned, if you're ever going to pick up Sybil, it is just incredibly graphic and incredibly disturbing. We'll take a moment away from the kind of more extreme disturbing stuff that I've read that I feel regretful over reading just based on traumatizing myself. And we'll go into something a little bit more lighthearted, like misogyny. If you haven't been on Booktube for a super long time like I have been, you might not have been aware that originally, kind of back in the day, like 2014, 2015, 16, there really was a huge emphasis on young adult novels. And it was kind of primarily the American side of Booktube then that was really into YA. And then we had the kind of like European or the UK based booktubers who were reading a little bit more literary fiction and just adult fiction. And there were certain people, and still are certain people, who were really, really into Haruki Murakami at the time. And I don't know if you've ever felt the same way, but for some reason when you come across someone who is hardcore into Haruki Murakami, they have a certain way of talking about his works that made me feel at the time as if I was missing out, and that I needed to read something by him in order to feel like I was like a true fan of literary fiction and magical realism and all that sort of thing. And I decided, okay, I'll give him a go. I'll get a random book of his out of the library. I really didn't know where to start because I feel like his backlog is just so big. And then there's certain novels that people just always praise. I ended up picking up Sputnik's Sweetheart, which was probably like the worst decision I could have ever made. I learned that Haruki Murakami, just from that one novel, writes his female characters in quite a misogynist way. And I found that he writes them in such a way that they're very self-serving to the male character, who's usually the lead character within his novels. I feel like people sold me a lie. Like the way some people talk about Haruki Murakami's work, they just really kind of like romanticize it and talk about like just how incredible and how moving and all this kind of stuff they found his work to be. I read Sputnik's Sweetheart and I was just like, really? Really? So basically we have three characters within this book, and our main male character, Kay, is in love with a woman who doesn't love him back. And she herself is in love with a woman who doesn't love her back. So basically it's about three somewhat miserable people not getting what they hoped for in life. Even if he'd had the relationship that he wanted with this woman, it still would have been a very one-sided relationship because he was all about fulfilling his own needs and his own wants and desires, but having no real interest in her as a person. It was more so just her as an object and what that object could bring to his life. I didn't get any of that like lovey-dovey feelings toward Haruki Murakami's writing from this, and realistically people have said since I read it, they said that I picked one of the worst books of his to start with. But to be perfectly honest, I've seen now over time multiple people come out and discuss how problematic Haruki Murakami's writing can be when it comes to how he writes women. And I was like, so validated in that moment, because I was like, it's not just me. It's not just me overthinking things. I got what I got from it because that's what it was. I honestly couldn't even recommend it to anyone. I feel like I couldn't even say like one positive thing about it. Another book that I feel did me dirty, and I feel so disappointed in having read it, was the Amityville Horror by Anson. So I know what you're thinking. You're like, Roya, you couldn't have been having super high hopes with this book. Like, it is, again, a book that is based on a hoax. And again, it had a lot of controversy based on that reasoning. But I still just thought it was going to be like a spooky, fun ride. And it was going to be something that would be just, a fun thing for a horror fan to read. And I have to say that it is probably the worst written book I have ever read in my entire life. So the book is about the Lutz family who moved into the Amityville house after there was a murder-suicide, and they believed in staying there that the house was actually haunted and that there was these weird things, paranormal things happening within the house. It turned out to be all a hoax, that they were just like trying to get a bit of attention and this and that. And funnily enough, I was researching the Amityville house, and I discovered that the current owners have remodeled the house significantly, so that they've taken away some of the more kind of iconic looks to the house. You can still tell that it's the Amityville house, but it's really their way of trying to deter tourists and sightseers from coming up to the house and taking photos and things like that, because obviously that's got to be super annoying. The story itself and how the book is written is just so atrocious. The only way I can say that it would be creepy or be genuinely scary is if you're a child reading the book. I feel like if I was between the ages of 8 and 11, I would be terrified reading this book. But because I wasn't, I was able to just analyze the fact that this was just so poorly written. I feel like it was also very poorly researched, because there's times where there's a lot of inconsistencies. And I feel like if you're telling something that is actively a fib, you should at least do your due diligence and go back and check that it was actually snowing on the days that you said that there was hoof prints in the snow. Maybe check that the date that you used is actually a date that there was snow in the area. Just saying. Another aspect about this book that really got under my skin when I was reading it was that the last sentence in each chapter always had to end in exclamation marks. I don't know why. I don't know why the author thought that this would emphasize the point that he's making more, that like how scary this certain thing is. And it just made it feel childish. As someone who has read a lot of horror novels, as someone who's watched a lot of horror films, as someone who is a big horror fan, I have to say that there is an art to subtlety, and this book just did not get the memo. Everything was over the top. Everything was exaggerated, because that is how poorly the writing structure for the entire book is. It is all just sensationalized. It is all just trying to blow up parts for attention. There's no atmosphere. There's no subtlety. There's no genuine kind of like storytelling. It's just crap for the most part. It really is. Am I glad I read it? I don't know. I suppose it's just one that I can tick off the list of like a horror book that I have read. But overall, it was kind of a waste of time. Now, I'm pretty sure I read it for the most part in one session. It didn't really take that long to read. And if you're someone who's curious about it, sure, give it a go, but don't expect it to like rock your world. Another horror novel that I was so disappointed in, and I hate this, I hate that I'm this person, is The Shining by Stephen King. Now, I think I gave this 2 stars at the time. I am someone who was so corrupted by the amount of times that I'd seen the film. When it came to actually sitting down and reading the book for the first time, the film absolutely ruined the book for me. And I am unfortunately one of those people who is like, the Kubrick film is way better than the book. Oh, it's so much more interesting and blah, blah, blah. And I hate that I'm that person. The way certain people talk about their experience reading The Shining is something that I'm just so jealous of, because I wish that that could have been my experience too. I wish that I wasn't waiting around for certain scenes that happened in the film that didn't actually happen at all in the book. I wish that I could have just enjoyed it for what it was, rather than waiting for certain scenes to come up, or waiting for certain scenes to come up in order to compare them to the film. Again, this is a book that took me quite a long time to read. I believe I was reading it for over a month. And had I made more of a consecutive effort to sit down and read it every day, or to read, 30 to 50 pages a day, maybe even then it would have improved my reading experience. Obviously, The Shining is one of Stephen King's most beloved books. And the fact that I couldn't really stand it, and there were certain moments in it that I thought were just really ridiculous, and I overall didn't find it scary or creepy. I felt that it lacked the atmosphere that I was specifically looking for. And I think what's also super annoying to me is the fact that the film The Shining is probably my favourite horror film of all time, just because I find that it's one of those films that I can always rewatch no matter what, and I will always notice something different in the background. I just find that it's just one of those films that has become a kind of comfort film for me for some reason, even though it was a film that when I originally tried to watch it as a small child, it absolutely terrified me. The bathroom scene with the old woman, I was just like, that moment I was like, fuck this, fuck you, I'm out of here. I have more of a solid memory when it comes to the film because of that reason, and I can go back and rewatch it and kind of laugh at those moments where I would have been just so genuinely terrified and stuff. But for whatever reason, I just couldn't get my head into the book at the time that I read it. Maybe it was just a bad time that I picked it up. Maybe I was already going through somewhat of a reading slump and it just didn't help. I wish I could have just read it for the first time now, and maybe it's something that I will revisit in the future and give it another go, and hopefully I can enjoy it for what it is, for the true original work that it is. Another horror novel that I really disliked when I read it and put me into a bit of a reading slump, and is the reason why I was so distrustful towards reading any modern horror novels, is Universal Harvester by John Darnielle. This book had such a great premise for me, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is because I've been getting re-triggered by it, because the idea of found footage or mixed media horror novels is becoming more popular, and this book is now making its way onto these lists for people to read, and every time I see it I'm like, no, you are not what you say you are. So the book itself takes place over 3 different time periods, and I feel like this is the first kind of flaw of the novel, that had it been condensed down and focused more on a particular individual timeline, that would have just been more beneficial. So the first time period is based in the 90s, where we have a person who's working in a video rental store who comes across really disturbing clips that have been spliced into some of the videos that have been rented by people. And then we have the 1970s timeline, which is about a young mother who ends up falling into a cult. And then we have the modern day timeline, where it's about a retired couple who have recently purchased a farmhouse, and while clearing it out, they discover a box of videotapes that have, again, really disturbing stuff on them. I thought that this sounded really cool at the time. I was like, this absolutely sounds like something I'm going to enjoy. There's no way I can't enjoy it. We even have the store worker who just gets progressively more and more obsessed with these clips that he's finding on these returned videotapes. But firstly, the book itself, it's jumping around a lot. So not only is it jumping back and forth in these various different time periods on these supposedly not super interconnected storylines, but you also have a jump from first person to third person back to first person. I found the story itself incredibly difficult to follow, and I feel like I was giving it my all. I really was believing that this was going to be a 5-star read for me, and I was very invested in it. And I came away being like, I'm not even sure what happened at certain points. I found that I'd have to continuously go back and reread certain paragraphs as if, my mind had wandered off, but it hadn't. It was just hard for me to grasp what was actually happening within the context of the story. It was very hard for me to visualize what was happening. And I'm not someone who suffers with a lack of imagination. I can read books as if I'm watching a film, and that's the way I remember them as well. And I feel like I came out of this with a very kind of grainy idea of what the story had to tell. This book literally put me off reading any sort of modern day horror writer for about 5 to 7 years. And it was only recently, in the last 2 years, that I've given myself the pass to try and explore modern day horror authors and new horror authors. And I'm having an absolute blast with that. And I am kicking myself that I was so soured on the whole experience of reading Universal Harvester that it affected my reading that profoundly. And especially when you're putting it up there as like a mixed media found footage horror film. There's so many other books that deliver on that concept in a much more impactful way than Universal Harvester could. But overall, my opinion of this book is that it sucked, and it is absolutely not worth any sort of hype that people are slowly but surely starting to build around it. And finally, the last book that I'm going to talk about for this video is a celebrity memoir. Now, I am a fan of reading a good juicy celebrity memoir now and again. I don't care if it's ghostwritten or not, I just want to know the goss. And this was a celebrity that I was never a massive fan of. I actively disliked him as a teenager based on certain things that I'd heard at the time about him and his behavior towards other bands on tour and things like that. But I ended up picking up The Long Hard Road Out of Hell by Marilyn Manson when I was in my early 20s or so. And I thought I'd give it a go because people did love citing that he is a very eloquent person, that he's very intelligent. And I always thought that was quite funny when people would say that about him. Just because someone is well spoken doesn't equate intelligence. Something that I always wonder is why certain celebrities decide to reveal incredibly alarming things about themselves within their memoirs. And this is something that I found Marilyn Manson did within his time and time again. There was a lot of exploration of his childhood and of certain family members. I don't understand why you would want to write about a family member in a way that makes them come across as an absolute sex pest and as a deviant. You know, maybe it was because he felt that it was his brand at the time. But in hindsight, a lot of the stuff that he revealed about himself in this book really doesn't fare well now with the allegations that have been made against him. And it really didn't change my mind about him as a person either. It really did outline like how problematic he is of a character and his thinking. And especially with revealing some of the things that he did, you know, it would make you scratch your head as to like, why would you want to let people know about that sort of thing? Like, that's the kind of stuff that you experience and then you take to the grave. You know, Anthony Kiedis of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, he outed himself as someone who had sex with a 14-year-old girl after he knew how old she was and bragged about it. You know, it's like there is like this era of rock stars who feel like they're completely untouchable and that they can put things in print themselves and sign off on it. For the longest time, I feel like certain men within the music industry, within the rock music industry, have gotten away with so much shit, and it is kind of nice to see certain people start to get their comeuppances for the fuck shit that they've been up to for all these fucking years. At the end of the day, I feel like I didn't really learn anything about Marilyn Manson as a person. I wasn't able to learn anything that would make me feel that like he's a redeemable character. It was very much written as the persona of Marilyn Manson and not the actual person behind the stage name. It wasn't particularly well written, it wasn't particularly interesting, and I came away just feeling grossed out by it for the most part. So those are all the books that disappointed me and made me regretful of the time that I spent reading them. If you enjoyed this video, let me know, because I can always do a part 2, because there are plenty of other books that I didn't talk about within this video that were equally regretful on my behalf. And of course, let me know if you agree or disagree. It's always good to have different opinions on books, especially when it comes to kind of like more negative opinions. And sometimes it's just nice to be validated as well. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram, on my TikTok, where I do short form bookish content that I don't necessarily share here on YouTube. If you haven't done so already, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and I greatly appreciate it. And of course, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.